Alex Banta. In May of 2018, a 65-year-old inmate at a medium-security prison in central Illinois was walked out of his housing unit by 3 correctional officers and into a vestibule with no cameras. He was handcuffed. He posed no threat. He was 4 months from parole on a theft conviction. What happened inside that vestibule left him with a punctured colon and internal injuries so severe he would die 6 weeks later. But the case that put those officers in federal prison did not come together because of the crime. It came together because one of them decided to talk. Alex Banta was a correctional officer at Western Illinois Correctional Center in Mount Sterling, a medium-security facility about 70 miles west of Springfield. On his first day on the job, according to what he later told a federal judge from the witness stand, Internal Affairs sat the new officers down and told them to forget everything they had learned at the academy. If things got physical with an inmate, they were told to aim for the body, not the face, so nothing would show. By the time Banta was arrested, he had spent enough time inside the walls of Western Illinois to know exactly which corners of the facility did not appear on camera. Larry Irvin was 65 and serving a sentence for theft. He had cycled in and out of the Illinois prison system for years, but this stretch was almost over. In 4 months, he would have been eligible for parole. Those who knew him described a man who had grown quiet with age, who no longer had the fight in him for a prison yard confrontation. On May 17th of 2018, Irvin was in a residential housing unit at Western Illinois when officers were dispatched to remove him and transfer him to segregation. Sergeant Willie Hedden, Lieutenant Todd Scheffler, and Officer Alex Banta arrived at his cell and placed him in handcuffs behind his back. Compliant and restrained, he was walked toward the segregation unit. The route took them through a small vestibule where the security cameras did not reach. Inside that vestibule, the beating began. Prosecutors would later reconstruct what happened using the testimony of Willie Hedden, who eventually turned on his co-defendants and cooperated with federal investigators. Irvin was thrown into a wall, his head striking with force. He was punched, kicked, and stomped by all 3 officers. The fatal blow, according to the government, came when Alex Banta jumped into the air and landed on Irvin's abdomen with both knees. Irvin was then dragged into segregation and left there. The injuries were catastrophic. Multiple ribs were broken. His mesentery, the tissue that anchors the intestines to the abdominal wall, was punctured. His colon was torn. Internal bleeding began almost immediately. He was eventually transferred to a hospital where his condition continued to deteriorate. He died on June 26th of 2018, 40 days after the assault. The initial reports written by the officers on duty described a very different incident. There had been resistance, they claimed. Force had been necessary. Nothing about a handcuffed man being knee-dropped from the air in a camera blind spot. If those reports had held, the case might have ended right there. But investigators from the FBI's Springfield office, working alongside the Illinois State Police and the Illinois Department of Corrections, began pulling apart the timeline. They interviewed inmates. They mapped the camera coverage of the facility. And they turned to Willie Hedden, an 18-year veteran of the Illinois Department of Corrections, who ultimately agreed to plead guilty and testify against Banta and Scheffler. How does an assault that took place in a room with no cameras and only correctional officer witnesses end up producing federal convictions? In December of 2019, a federal grand jury indicted all 3 men on charges that included conspiracy to deprive civil rights, deprivation of civil rights resulting in death, obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of documents, and misleading conduct. The government's theory was straightforward. The officers had beaten Larry Irvin in the vestibule and then coordinated to conceal what they had done. The trial ran 4 weeks in the spring of 2022. Willie Hedden took the stand as the government's central witness and described, blow by blow, what the three of them had done to Larry Irvin. He admitted his own role. He apologized in court to Irvin's son, Larry Pippian. The jury convicted Alex Banta on all counts. The first jury hung on Todd Scheffler, and he was retried in August of that year, at which point a second jury convicted him on 5 counts. On March 16th of 2023, Senior United States District Judge Sue Myerscough sentenced Alex Banta. He had faced a maximum of life in federal prison. She gave him 20 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release. 5 days later, she handed Todd Scheffler the same sentence, 20 years. Willie Hedden, whose cooperation was central to the government's ability to convict the other two, was sentenced the day after that to 6 years. Todd Scheffler appealed. His attorneys argued that the evidence was insufficient to support his convictions and raised a series of procedural challenges. On January 8th of 2025, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals rejected every argument and affirmed his convictions in full, holding that sufficient evidence supported the jury's verdict. At his own sentencing, Alex Banta spoke about the culture he had been trained into at Western Illinois, the instructions to aim for the body and not the face, the understanding shared among officers about which corners of the facility were beyond the reach of the cameras. He acknowledged what he had done to Larry Irvin. As of the current date, Alex Banta and Todd Scheffler are both serving their 20-year sentences in federal custody. Willie Hedden is serving his 6-year term. Larry Irvin, 4 months from freedom when the officers came for him, is buried in Illinois. Larry Irvin's death depended on a room without cameras and 3 officers willing to lie about what happened inside it. But not every officer who kills an inmate on the job takes that much care to hide the evidence. Some do it in front of nurses. Some give the order out loud before they raise a hand. 8 years before Larry Irvin was beaten in that Illinois vestibule, a lieutenant at a state prison in southeastern Alabama walked into a dormitory and told his subordinates exactly what he was about to do. Michael Smith. On the evening of August 4th of 2010, a 24-year-old inmate at Ventress Correctional Facility in Clayton, Alabama, got into a fistfight with a female officer at his bunk. The officer's lip was bleeding when the shift lieutenant arrived. Standing in that dormitory, the lieutenant told his officers not to worry, that they were going to kill the inmate. Over the next several hours, that is exactly what he did. But it took the federal government almost 3 years to bring a case, and when it did, the judge would use a phrase rarely spoken from the bench. Depraved heart. Michael Smith was 38 years old at the time of the incident, a correctional lieutenant and shift supervisor with the Alabama Department of Corrections, assigned to Ventress in Barber County. He lived in Auburn. He had been with the department long enough to be trusted with a shift, and that trust included the discretion to decide when force was necessary and how much of it to apply. Rocrast Mack was 24 years old and serving a 20-year sentence out of Montgomery County on a drug conviction. He had been at Ventress for a stretch. By all accounts, he was not considered one of the facility's serious problems. The altercation with Officer Melissa Brown began around 7:30 on the evening of August 4th. Brown discovered Mack in his bunk in D dorm and confronted him. The two of them exchanged blows. Brown backed away and used her radio to call for assistance. Her lip was bleeding. Michael Smith arrived within minutes. He ordered Mack taken to an office in the dormitory, and once inside, he began to beat him. He struck Mack repeatedly with a fiberglass baton, swinging it at the back of his head with enough force that the baton itself eventually broke. He stomped Mac. He kicked him. At close range, he sprayed him with chemical spray until Mac was disoriented and struggling to breathe. Mac was eventually taken to the prison's medical unit and placed on a bed under restraint. He was still alive. The nurses on duty were the last barrier between him and further violence. Smith ordered them out of the room. Once they were gone, he pulled the restrained inmate off the bed and stomped on his head repeatedly until Mac lost consciousness. He was transported to a Montgomery hospital, and on August 5th of 2010, he was declared dead. The Alabama Department of Corrections issued its initial account of what happened. Rocrast Mac, according to that account, had assaulted a staff member and resisted restraint. Force had been used to bring him under control. He had died the following day. For a while, that version held, but the FBI's Mobile Division, working with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, began interviewing witnesses inside the facility, including the nurses who had been ordered out of the medical room. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice took the case, and on March 12th of 2012, a federal grand jury returned a 17-count indictment against Michael Smith and 3 of his subordinates. How does a prison lieutenant announce a killing to his own officers, carry it out over the course of an evening in front of medical staff, and still manage to convince the state that a use-of-force protocol was followed? The trial began in the middle of 2013. On June 25th, a federal jury convicted Michael Smith on 7 counts, including 2 civil rights violations and 5 obstruction-related offenses. The other 3 officers, Matthew Davidson, Joseph Sanders, and Scotty Glenn, had all entered guilty pleas earlier and cooperated with the prosecution. On November 4th of 2013, United States District Judge Myron Thompson sentenced Michael Smith to 30 years in federal prison. From the bench, Judge Thompson said that Smith had acted with a depraved heart, that he had tortured Rocrast Mac, and that the sentence was intended to reflect the gravity of what he had done. Matthew Davidson received 7 years. Joseph Sanders received 5. Scotty Glenn, whose plea had come earliest in the process, received 5 years. Michael Smith appealed. His attorneys argued that certain statements he had made during the Internal Department of Corrections investigation had been coerced under the Supreme Court's Garrity ruling, which shields state employees from being compelled to incriminate themselves. On April the 29th of 2016, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the argument, holding that Smith had knowingly waived his rights and understood the consequences of doing so. His convictions were affirmed. Rocrast Mac's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Alabama Department of Corrections. The case settled for $900,000. Of that amount, $440,000 was set aside for Mac's son, Rocrast Mac Jr. As of the current date, Michael Smith is serving his 30-year sentence in federal custody. His conviction is final. The 3 officers who accepted plea deals have completed their sentences and been released. Michael Smith's prosecution was carried by a federal investigation that refused to accept the department's initial account. The next case moves west to California, where the department itself joined the prosecution. The 3 deputies who beat an inmate to death in his cell were charged not with a federal civil rights violation, but with murder in state court. The outcome would take almost a decade to settle, and when it did, the answer was not what the family had been promised. Jerry Lubrin. On a summer night in 2015, 3 correctional deputies at the Santa Clara County Main Jail in San Jose, California, entered the cell of a 31-year-old inmate who had refused his medication earlier that day. Other inmates on the tier could hear him. He had a distinctive voice, and they testified later that he was pleading, apologizing, asking the deputies to stop. Within an hour, he was dead. But the case that followed would not end with the deputies serving life sentences. It would end, 9 years later, with all three walking out of court as free men. Jerry Lubrin, Matthew Farris, and Rafael Rodriguez were correctional deputies with the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, assigned to the main jail in downtown San Jose. All three worked the same overnight shift. According to trial evidence, Lubrin was the most vocal about the physical side of the job. Colleagues would later testify that he had described beating people up as part of what he did at the jail. Michael Tyree was 31 years old. He was mentally ill. He had been booked into the main jail on misdemeanor theft and drug charges, and he was waiting for a bed to open up in a residential mental health treatment facility. He had a young daughter. On the evening of August 26th of 2015, he had refused to take his prescribed medication. Around 11 that night, the three deputies conducted a routine clothing exchange and cell search on Tyree's housing unit. They entered his cell. What happened inside was not captured on video, but the aftermath and the sounds carried by the tier would form the core of the case against them. Inmates in adjacent cells heard Tyree screaming. They heard him say he was sorry. They heard him ask the deputies to stop. Within roughly an hour of the encounter, a welfare check was conducted, and Tyree was found unresponsive in his cell. He had bled internally to the point of losing an estimated half of his blood volume. His liver had been severely lacerated. His spleen was nearly torn in half. The initial reaction inside the jail treated the death as a medical event. But when Santa Clara County Medical Examiner Dr. Joseph O'Hara conducted the autopsy several days later, he classified the death as a homicide caused by blunt force trauma. From that moment forward, the incident became a criminal investigation, and the three deputies who had been in Michael Tyree's cell became the suspects. The evidence built from there. Investigators reviewed digital activity on the deputies' personal devices in the days after the killing. Rafael Rodriguez had used an internet search engine to ask whether a person could die from being punched in the armpit. Jerry Lubrin's own statements to co-workers about the role that violence played in his job would be introduced as evidence of his mindset. The same night the three deputies had been in Tyree's cell, they were also alleged to have assaulted another inmate, Juan Villa, a separate charge that would proceed alongside the murder counts. Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen brought the case. All three deputies were arrested in September of 2015 and released after posting $1.5 million each in bail. How is it possible that three law enforcement officers, entering a locked cell under the color of official duty, could be convicted of murder for what happened inside it, and then, 7 years later, have those convictions completely overturned? The first jury reached its verdict in June of 2017. Jerry Lubrin, Matthew Farris, and Rafael Rodriguez were each convicted of second-degree murder in the killing of Michael Tyree. On September 1st of that year, Judge David Sena sentenced all three to 15 years to life in state prison. The problem, from a legal standpoint, arrived a few years later. In 2018, California passed Senate Bill 1437, which sharply limited the state's ability to convict a defendant of murder based on shared responsibility for a killing when the individual defendant's role in causing the death could not be independently proven. Because the prosecution had never been able to establish which of the three deputies delivered the blows that actually killed Michael Tyree, the new law reached back into the case. In 2022, a California appellate court reversed the murder convictions. In February of 2024, the appellate court affirmed the reversal again. In April of that year, the California Supreme Court declined to take the state's petition for review. The murder convictions were gone. Rather than retry the case with the reduced tools available under the new law, the district attorney's office offered a plea. On August 13th of 2024, All three deputies pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, admitting that they had beaten Michael Tyree with conscious disregard for human life. Each received the statutory maximum of 11 years, inclusive of the roughly 7 years each had already served in state custody. They had already been released from state prison the previous month and placed on home confinement. On October 22nd of 2024, at a hearing before Judge Benjamin Williams, their sentences were deemed satisfied by time already served combined with good behavior credits. Santa Clara County paid $3.6 million to settle a civil lawsuit brought by Michael Tyree's family. His two sisters and his young daughter shared the settlement. The family's attorney, Paula Canny, described the money as the most bittersweet money she had ever helped anyone collect. As of the current date, Jerry Lubrin, Matthew Ferris, and Rafael Rodriguez are free. Their operative convictions are for voluntary manslaughter rather than murder. They served roughly 7 years in state prison for the death of Michael Tyree. California's answer to the killing of Michael Tyree was 7 years of prison time and a plea to a lesser charge. The next case moves east to a small county jail in Kentucky, where a man arrested for public intoxication would spend the last 36 hours of his life restrained to a chair, dragged in and out of a bathroom the cameras could not see, and eventually left to die in front of 5 deputies who would each face criminal charges for what they did to him. Brad Roberts. In late November of 2018, a 40-year-old man from Ashland, Kentucky, was booked into the Boyd County Detention Center on a public intoxication charge. It was the kind of arrest that ordinarily ends with a night in a holding cell and a release the next morning. He never left. Over the next 36 hours, he was strapped into a restraint chair, taken into a bathroom outside camera coverage, tased, and left as he began to seize. When he stopped moving, the coroner would find 3 fractured ribs and internal bleeding. But almost every step of what the deputies did was recorded on 28 separate videos. Brad Roberts was a sergeant and the night shift supervisor at the Boyd County Detention Center in Catlettsburg, Kentucky, a small facility across the Ohio River from West Virginia. He lived in nearby Westwood. Working under him on the shift in question were 4 other jail staff members. Zachary Messer, a deputy jailer from Ashland, Colton Griffith from Flatwoods, Jeremy Maddox from Grayson, and Alicia Beller, the control room officer, who watched the security monitors and controlled the movement of doors and personnel throughout the facility. Michael Lee Moore was 40 years old, from Ashland. He was heavily intoxicated at the time of his arrest and had been taking a prescription medication called baclofen, a muscle relaxant that can produce disorientation and erratic behavior when combined with alcohol. He was booked into the Boyd County Detention Center late on the night of November 27th of 2018. Because of his condition, staff placed him in a restraint chair, a device designed to immobilize a combative or self-harming detainee for short periods while they calm down or receive medical evaluation. He would spend most of the next day and a half in that chair. Jail security footage, which prosecutors would later present to the jury across 28 separate video segments, captured most of what happened. Deputies could be seen pushing Moore's head into a concrete wall. They wrestled him to the floor. At one point, one of the officers deployed a taser against him while he was already restrained. When they returned him to the restraint chair, they were seen throwing him into it with force. The fatal injury occurred in a location the cameras did not reach. There was a restroom inside the jail that was not under surveillance. According to trial testimony from Kentucky State Police Alicia Beller, monitoring the audio feed from the control room, reported hearing what she described as a cracking sound while Moore was in the bathroom with the deputies. Later, Brad Roberts was overheard telling other staff that the officers had been too rough with him. Moore was returned to the housing area and eventually moved to a bunk. Over the following hours, he fell from a top bunk multiple times during what witnesses described as seizure-like episodes. At no point during those falls, or the extended period of visible distress that followed, was medical assistance summoned. On the morning of November 29th of 2018, Michael Lee Moore was found unresponsive in his restraint chair. He was pronounced dead a short time later. Kentucky State Police from Post 14 in Ashland were called to the facility. An autopsy performed at the Frankfurt Medical Examiner's office identified the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the torso. 3 of his ribs were fractured. Internal bleeding had killed him. Boyd County Commonwealth's attorney Rhonda Copley took the case. In December of 2018, a state grand jury indicted all 5 staff members on charges of first-degree manslaughter. Additional criminal abuse counts were added to the indictments for the 4 deputies directly involved in the physical handling of Moore. Brad Roberts alone faced 16 separate counts. What does it take, in a country where use of force by jail staff is one of the most difficult categories of case to prosecute, for 5 separate corrections officers to face criminal charges for the death of a single inmate? 28 separate segments of the treatment of Michael Moore, played in court, made the internal culture of the shift impossible for a jury to look away from. Alicia Beller, the control room officer, was the first to accept a plea. In May of 2019, she pleaded guilty to first-degree wanton endangerment. In exchange for a sworn statement and her testimony against her co-defendants, she received a 5-year diverted sentence with no prison time and was permanently barred from working in corrections. Brad Roberts went to trial. He was convicted, and in November of 2021, he was sentenced to 15 years in Kentucky State Prison. In September of 2023, through a mediated plea agreement, Zachary Messer received 20 years, the harshest sentence handed down in the case. His sentence combined 10 years for first-degree criminal abuse, 5 years for second-degree criminal abuse, and 5 years for facilitation to manslaughter. Colton Griffith received 6 years, 2 consecutive 3-year terms for second-degree criminal abuse. Jeremy Maddox received 5 years for second-degree criminal abuse. The Boyd County Fiscal Court and its insurance carrier settled a civil lawsuit brought by Michael Moore's estate for $1.75 million on June 19th of 2019, a little more than 6 months after his death. As of the current date, Brad Roberts is serving his 15-year sentence. Zachary Messer is serving 20 years. Colton Griffith is serving 6, and Jeremy Maddox is serving 5. Alicia Beller completed her diverted sentence outside of custody and is no longer eligible for work in Kentucky Corrections. Michael Lee Moore's death, 36 hours after being booked for a nonviolent misdemeanor, remains one of the most extensively documented in-custody killings in the history of the Kentucky State prison system. If you're finding value in these deep dives, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep going. David Kingsley. On the afternoon of December 9th of 2024, a 43-year-old inmate was transferred from one New York State prison to another for his own safety. He walked into the infirmary at the receiving facility in handcuffs. Less than 7 hours later, he was dead. What made the case unprecedented was not the beating itself, or even that officers were charged with murder for it. It was that the assault took place in the one room the guards thought had no cameras, and was captured anyway by body cameras that none of them had bothered to turn on. David J. Kingsley II was 45 years old, a corrections officer with the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, known as DOC-CIS. He was from Adams in upstate New York and had been assigned to Marcy Correctional Facility in Oneida County. Prosecutors would later describe Kingsley as weighing close to 300 pounds. His exact hire date and tenure were never fully disclosed publicly, but he was one of 13 officers suspended without pay in the days after the killing. He resigned in May of 2025, roughly 3 months after his arraignment. Robert L. Brooks Sr. was 43 years old, from Rochester, New York. He was serving a 12-year sentence out of a 2017 first-degree assault conviction. He was a musician. He had earned his high school equivalency behind bars and was scheduled for release in 2026. On the morning of December 9th of 2024, he was transferred from Mohawk Correctional Facility to Marcy after altercations at Mohawk had left him with head and facial injuries. The transfer, on paper, was made for his own safety. He arrived at Marcy in handcuffs and was taken to a medical examination room in the infirmary. That room had been chosen, prosecutors would later say, because it did not have permanent surveillance cameras. Medical privacy rules kept them out. The officers assigned to Brooks that afternoon believed the room was unrecorded. They were wrong. 4 of the officers were wearing body cameras. None of them had manually activated the recording function. But every DOC-CS body camera runs a continuous silent buffer, capturing 30-minute video-only loops in standby mode, even when the officer has not turned it on. Those buffers, from 4 different angles, captured most of the assault. The recording showed Officer Christopher Walrath rushing at Brooks first, putting him in a headlock without any observable provocation. Other officers collapsed in around him. Officer Nicholas Kiefer sprayed Brooks with chemical spray and radioed for backup from Kingsley and another officer, Matthew Gallagher, even though Brooks was not resisting. When Kingsley arrived, he was captured on camera grabbing the much smaller Brooks by the neck, applying pressure to his throat, lifting him off the examination table by the neck multiple times, and holding him against a wall with his feet off the ground while other officers punched, kneed, and kicked him. Brooks was placed in leg irons while he was already unconscious. Photographs later introduced at trial showed Kingsley and Gallagher laughing after Brooks was dead. He was pronounced dead at Wynn Hospital in Utica at 3:52 in the morning on December 10th of 2024, less than 7 hours after arriving at Marcy. The Onondaga County Medical Examiner ruled the death a homicide, caused by compression of the neck and multiple blunt impact injuries. New York Attorney General Letitia James publicly released the body camera footage on December 27th of 2024. She described the footage as shocking and disturbing. The release triggered national coverage. On December 28th, the FBI's Albany field office announced it was reviewing the case for a possible federal response. Governor Kathy Hochul ordered the firing of 13 officers and a nurse. The Attorney General's office recused itself in early January over a conflict of interest, and Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick was appointed as special prosecutor. How does a beating carried out in the one room the officers were certain had no cameras become one of the most extensively documented in-custody killings in New York State history? On February 20th of 2025, a grand jury indicted 10 officers. Kingsley was charged with second-degree depraved indifference murder and first-degree manslaughter. He rejected a plea offer that would have capped his sentence at 18 years and elected to go to trial. He was tried jointly with Matthew Gallagher and Nicholas Kiefer in Oneida County Court beginning October 6th of 2025. The prosecution presented roughly 6 days of testimony, including the medical examiner, cooperating officers who had accepted pleas, and the 4 angles of body camera footage. The defense called no witnesses. On October 20th of 2025, the jury returned a split verdict. Kingsley was convicted of second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. Gallagher and Kiefer were acquitted of all charges. A juror later told reporters that the evidence had shown Kingsley strangling Brooks to death, and that his conduct had been distinguishable from that of the other officers in the room. On December 19th of 2025, Oneida County Court Judge Robert Bauer imposed the maximum sentence: 25 years to life for the murder count, and a concurrent 25 years for manslaughter, with 5 years of post-release supervision. According to Special Prosecutor Fitzpatrick, this was the first time in the history of the New York State prison system that a corrections officer had been convicted and sentenced for murdering an inmate. 9 other officers were charged in connection with the killing. Nicholas Anzalone and Anthony Farina each received 22 years for first-degree manslaughter. Christopher Walrath, who had initiated the assault and was the first to plead, received 15 years. Michael Mashaw received 3 to 9 years. David Walters received 2 1/3 to 7 years. Nicholas Gentile received a conditional discharge for tampering with evidence. Michael Fisher took a plea to a misdemeanor after a January trial deadlocked. 2 cooperating officers who testified against the defendants received 2-year and 4-year sentences. The same day Kingsley was sentenced, Governor Hochul signed a sweeping prison reform package into law, mandating expanded surveillance and body cameras across the state system. As of the current date, David Kingsley is serving his 25-to-life sentence in New York State custody. His first parole eligibility falls roughly 25 years from sentencing. Robert Brooks Sr. would have completed his own sentence and walked out of Marcy in 2026. The Kingsley conviction rested on video the guards did not know was being recorded, and on a special prosecutor willing to seek a maximum sentence. The next case, out of Louisiana, involved a beating that lasted only a matter of minutes, produced no fatality, and might have gone unpunished entirely if not for a local television news investigation. Javarea Pouncey. In September of 2019, a 25-year-old man was arrested in DeSoto Parish, Louisiana, on a nonviolent charge and taken to the parish detention center for a routine strip search. The strip search itself took about 6 minutes. He came out of that laundry room with a broken nose, a fractured eye socket, and a face so swollen it was barely recognizable. But the 2 deputies who put him there had not counted on a local television station taking an interest in the case, or on what came after. Javarea Pouncey was 31 years old at the time of the federal indictment, a correctional sergeant with the DeSoto Parish Sheriff's Office in Louisiana. DeSoto Parish sits in the northwest corner of the state, about 40 miles south of Shreveport. Pouncey had been with the sheriff's office long enough to have earned his rank. On the day in question, he was working alongside Deputy DeMarcus Grant. Jarius Brown was 25 years old. He had been arrested on a nonviolent offense and brought to the DeSoto Parish Detention Center for booking. During the booking process, deputies conducted what should have been a routine strip search. He was compliant. He posed no threat. There was no indication in any of the reports that he had done anything to warrant use of force. On September 27th of 2019, Pouncey and Grant led Brown into a laundry room off the booking area of the detention center. According to an Associated Press investigation and later federal court filings, the 2 deputies threw roughly 50 punches at Brown over the course of the strip search while he was naked. The entire encounter lasted about 6 minutes. Brown came out of the laundry room with a broken nose, a fractured eye socket, and severe facial swelling. Photographs would later document injuries consistent with an extended beating. Pouncey then failed to secure medical care for him and prepared a report for the sheriff's office that omitted or falsified the circumstances of what had happened inside the laundry room. For a period of time, the falsified report was the operative account of the incident. Brown was not a fatality, and detention center beatings that do not produce a body rarely generate the kind of institutional response required to make anything happen. The turning point in the case came from outside the sheriff's office entirely. Shreveport television station KSLA aired an investigation into the incident, which drew the attention of Louisiana State Police. The State Police Review, combined with a complaint filed by the American Civil Liberties Union of Louisiana on behalf of Brown, escalated the matter to federal investigators. The FBI's New Orleans field office took the case. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, working through the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Louisiana, presented the matter to a federal grand jury in Shreveport. On September 6 of 2023, 4 years after the incident, the grand jury returned a 3-count indictment against Pouncey. What are the mechanics by which a jail beating that leaves no body and produces no immediate consequence for the officers involved becomes, 4 years later, a federal civil rights prosecution? Pouncey entered a guilty plea to 1 count of using excessive force. On October 15 of 2024, at his sentencing hearing in Federal District Court in Shreveport, he was sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. He also received 3 years of supervised release. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, in a statement issued by the Justice Department, described what Pouncey had done as a betrayal of his oath to serve his community, saying that he had repeatedly punched a detainee without justification and left him bloodied and broken. DeMarcus Grant, the other deputy involved, had entered his own guilty plea earlier in the process. He pleaded guilty on September 5 of 2023 to 1 count of obstruction of justice in connection with the falsified report on the incident. He was sentenced to 10 months in federal prison and was released in April of 2025 after completing his term. Jarius Brown filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Pouncey and the DeSoto Parish Sheriff's Office under Section 1983, seeking damages for the beating. That lawsuit was dismissed as time-barred under Louisiana's 1-year statute of limitations. The dismissal was appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which affirmed the trial court's ruling. A separate state court civil action remained pending, but no monetary settlement had been reported as of the most recent public filings. As of the most recent Associated Press reporting, Javarea Pouncey remained in federal custody, serving his 37-month sentence, with a projected release date sometime in the following year. DeMarcus Grant is out. Jarius Brown, who survived the beating, has not yet recovered civil damages for what was done to him. The Justice Department cited the case in subsequent public statements as an illustration of what the Civil Rights Division was willing to do when a detention center beating went unaddressed at the state and local level. The DeSoto Parish case took federal intervention to reach an outcome the state had not delivered on its own. But the federal system does not only step in when the local authorities refuse to act. Sometimes it steps in because the death itself was so preventable, so clearly the result of a single officer's refusal to summon help that no one else was in a position to build the case. That was the story of what happened one August night in 2012 inside a mental health unit at Rikers Island. Terrence Pendergrass. On the night of August 18th of 2012, a 25-year-old man being held on a burglary charge in a mental health unit at Rikers Island in New York swallowed a packet of caustic industrial disinfectant that had been distributed after a sewage backup. As the chemical began to burn through him, he begged for help. Officers went to the captain on duty and told him what was happening. A pharmacy technician also went to the captain. The captain refused to summon a doctor. He told his subordinates not to bother him unless someone was dead. Terrence Pendergrass was a correction captain with the New York City Department of Correction, assigned to Rikers Island. He was from Howard Beach, Queens, and was in his early 50s at the time of the incident. Rikers Island, sitting in the East River between the Bronx and Queens, was at that time the primary jail complex for New York City, holding pretrial detainees and inmates serving short sentences. Pendergrass had risen through the ranks to become a supervising officer. Jason Echevarria was 25 years old. He had bipolar disorder. He was being held at Rikers on a burglary charge and had been placed in the Mental Health Assessment Unit for infracted inmates, known within the facility by its acronym MCHAWI. The unit was reserved for detainees with mental health diagnoses who had received disciplinary infractions inside the jail. On August 18th of 2012, a sewage backup flooded a number of cells in the unit. In response, jail staff distributed what were referred to as soap balls to the inmates, small packets of a powerful industrial disinfectant designed to break down organic waste. The chemical was not intended for use in enclosed cells or in proximity to human skin, and it was not intended, under any circumstance, to be ingested. Jason Echevarria swallowed one of the packets. Within a short time, the chemical began to cause severe internal injuries. He was in visible distress. He was vomiting. He was asking for help. Multiple officers on the unit, aware of what had happened, went to the captain on duty and reported it. A pharmacy technician who had learned of the ingestion also relayed the information to the captain and specifically advised that medical care was required. Terrence Pendergrass refused to summon a doctor. According to trial testimony, he ordered one officer who was attempting to call for medical help to hang up the phone. He was reported to have said that he should only be called if there was a need to extract an inmate from a cell, or if there was a dead body. A fired officer would later testify that Pendergrass had told him not to bother him unless someone was dead. Jason Echevarria was left in his cell overnight. He was found dead the next morning. The medical examiner concluded that he had died from the injuries caused by ingesting the caustic substance. Why does a captain with the authority to summon medical help, informed multiple times by his own officers and by a pharmacy technician that an inmate has swallowed a substance capable of killing him, choose to leave him in a cell to die? The case was investigated by the FBI. United States Attorney Preet Bharara, for the Southern District of New York, brought federal charges against Pendergrass for deprivation of rights under color of law. Bharara, in a public statement after the indictment, said that Pendergrass had stood deaf to Jason Echevarria's pleas for help, and that Pendergrass would now himself be an inmate, entitled to and expecting better treatment than what he had given. Pendergrass was tried in Manhattan federal court. On December 17th of 2014, after a week of trial, the jury convicted him on the single federal count. On May 3rd of 2016, United States District Judge Ronnie Abrams sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. The sentence was an upward variance from the sentencing guideline range, which had called for a term between 21 and 27 months. Judge Abrams cited what she described as Pendergrass's indifference and callousness as the basis for the departure. Pendergrass appealed. On April 28th of 2016, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed both his conviction and his sentence, rejecting arguments related to ineffective assistance of counsel and the length of the sentence. Jason Echevarria's estate reached a civil settlement with the City of New York and 2 other jail officers, Raymond Castro and Dion Brown, totaling $3.8 million. The city paid the bulk of the settlement. As of the current date, Terrence Pendergrass has completed his federal sentence. He was released from a low-security federal facility in Michigan in December of 2019. Jason Echevarria, held in a mental health unit on a burglary charge and left to die from a swallowed disinfectant, remains one of the most cited cases in the modern history of pretrial detention in New York. Terrence Pendergrass killed Jason Echevarria through inaction by refusing to summon the medical help that was available a phone call away. The final case in this list involved a killing carried out through direct action by 4 Florida corrections officers who beat a 60-year-old man so badly he had to be carried to the transport van he died in. Christopher Rowland. On Valentine's Day of 2022, a 60-year-old mentally ill inmate at Dade Correctional Institution in South Florida was scheduled to be transferred to another prison. Before he left his cell, he threw a cup of urine at a guard. What followed, in the words of the Miami-Dade state attorney who eventually filed murder charges, was back alley justice. By the time the transport van carrying him reached its next stop in Central Florida, he was dead inside it. The medical examiner would count roughly 20 broken ribs and a punctured lung. Christopher Rowland, Kirk Walton, and Jeremy Godbolt were correctional officers with the Florida Department of Corrections, assigned to Dade Correctional Institution in southern Miami-Dade County. Rowland was 29 years old at the time of the incident, Walton 34, and Godbolt 28. A 4th officer, Ronald Connor, was 24. All 4 worked shifts inside the facility's mental health unit. Ronald Gene Ingram was 60 years old. He was mentally ill. He was serving a life sentence out of a first-degree murder conviction from earlier in his life. On February 14th of 2022, he was scheduled to be moved from the mental health unit at Dade Correctional to another Florida prison. Before the officers came to remove him from his cell for the transfer, he threw a cup of urine at one of them. He was handcuffed and taken out of his cell. Security footage from the corridor showed him walking normally, his legs strong under him. The transfer would have been unremarkable if it had ended there. It did not. The officers took him to a location within the facility that fell outside camera coverage. In that blind spot, according to state investigators and the eventual court testimony of a fellow officer who was granted immunity, they beat him. By the time they brought him back into view of the cameras, he could no longer stand. 2 of the officers were carrying him. He was loaded into a secure single-occupant compartment inside a transport van and driven away from Dade Correctional en route to Lake Correctional Institution in Claremont. The van stopped in Ocala, roughly halfway between the origin and destination. When staff opened the compartment, Ronald Ingram was dead inside it. The medical examiner in Marion County conducted the autopsy. The cause of death was ruled blunt force trauma. A punctured lung, internal bleeding. Roughly 20 of his ribs were broken. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, known as FDLE, opened a months-long investigation. Central to the case was a fellow officer at Dade Correctional who agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. That witness placed Rowland, Walton, Godbolt, and Connor in the room during the beating. On April the 28th and 29th of 2022, all 4 were arrested. Godbolt was taken into custody at Los Angeles International Airport, having apparently attempted to leave the state. Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle charged all 4 with second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit second-degree murder, aggravated abuse of an elderly or disabled person, and cruel treatment of a detainee. In public statements at the time of the arrests, she described what the officers had done as back alley justice. How does a compliant, handcuffed inmate walking normally into a camera blind spot inside a Florida state prison come out of that blind spot with roughly 20 broken ribs and a punctured lung, and die inside a locked van 2 hours down the road? The prosecution offered plea deals to 3 of the 4 officers. Christopher Rowland, Kirk Walton, and Jeremy Godbolt accepted. Each pleaded guilty. On October 25th of 2024, Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Teresa Pooler sentenced all three to 20 years in Florida State Prison. Walton and Roland later attempted to withdraw their pleas. Judge Pooler denied the motions. From the bench, she described the crime as heinous and horrible, and stated that but for the plea deals that had been extended to the officers, she would have sentenced them to life. She described Ronald Ingram as having died in the worst way possible, alone and in pain in the back of a prison vehicle, chained. Ronald Connor, the fourth officer, was not offered a plea. He elected to go to trial. The three co-defendants who had already pleaded guilty testified against him under the terms of their agreements. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury acquitted Connor of the murder charge and 5 of the 6 other counts against him. He was convicted of a single misdemeanor count of culpable negligence. Because he had already served roughly 2 years in pretrial custody, he was credited with time served and released. As of the current date, Christopher Roland, Kirk Walton, and Jeremy Godbolt are serving their 20-year Florida state sentences. Ronald Connor is free. The Florida Department of Corrections continues to operate Dade Correctional Institution, though the mental health unit where Ronald Ingram spent his last years has been the subject of a series of state investigations into the treatment of mentally ill inmates. If any of these cases hit differently than the others, the comments are open. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.